Chapter 8. A Flight Interrupted. Memory is a way of holding on to the things you love, the things you are, the things you never want to lose. Kevin Arnold. He was home. It was nippy inside, as if the stove's warmth could not push back the chill of the spring morning. Chris could smell the bread baking, but the house was empty, and no one responded when he called out. The only noise was a truck rumbling by outside and men's voices talking quietly in the distance. Jess's room looked as if she had just jumped out of bed. The bed was unmade, and there was a pair of dirty socks beside it. A note on the floor in their mother's handwriting read, "Jess, honey, please go to town, take that load of apples, and see what you can get of flour and sugar." Reading it, he knew then he was in a dream. Jess had gone to the store that day, the last day any of them had ever been together as a family, the last day any of them had been free. He moved on to his room. It, too, looked just as he had left it, and was far more of a mess than Jess's room could ever be. Dirty laundry, unmade bed, and his belongings were scattered about, a maze of clutter on the floor. He was surprised by it somehow. "I was such a complete slob," Chris muttered to himself. He closed the door and headed for his parents' room. It was empty. The bed was made, and his mother's pajamas were neatly folded near the pillow on her side of the bed. Perhaps everyone is outside, he thought, and headed back through the kitchen to go into the backyard. The bread was baking in the oven, and he could tell it was nearly time to pull it out. Over the years, they had all developed a nose for it. Flour was short, so they ate every bit that came out of that oven. If they didn't want burned bread, it was in everyone's interest to keep an eye, or nose, out. He opened the sliding glass door, and the sun blinded his eyes. He had little time to wonder how morning had turned to late afternoon and a pulsing ball of fire that hung in the west. Dreams held no standards. They knew no scientific laws or rules of physics. His gaze was drawn to his parents, standing there, arms raised in the air. His father looked sad. His mother was scared and crying. Michael Aronson spoke softly. "Please, Chris, don't shoot your mother, shoot me." Chris looked down and realized the rifle in his hands pointed directly at Julie Aronson's chest. "It'll be okay, son. I know they told you to do it. Just shoot me and let your mother go." But the rifle barked out one shot, and he watched his mother fall to the ground, blood staining the front of her shirt. His father turned away from Chris, his face set in sorrow, and knelt by Julie Aronson's body, hands to her chest. Her eyes were wide and staring, and there was a single teardrop on her left cheek. Chris's father didn't seem to notice the blood bubbling over his hands and soaking his clothes. He kissed his wife, then turned back to look at his son. "Oh, son, what have you done?" It was his scream that gave him away and brought the two soldiers to his hideaway. The dream faded, and Chris opened his eyes to the sight of a rifle barrel and booted foot. He followed the boot up to a leg, up further to the chest and the scraggly beard and gap-toothed grin of Tim Easter. The bastard looked delighted to find him. "Hey there, shithead, where'd you think you were headin'?" He twirled his rifle around and smashed the butt end hard into Chris's forehead. His head bounced once on the ground, and before he blacked out, he heard Easter and another soldier laughing. Pain. A slow drip making its way down his forehead, down the left side of his head and falling slowly, one drop at a time, from his cheek. It was dark out, but he could smell beans and feel a smidgen of warmth from the campfire. Chris tried to move and couldn't. No surprise there, his arms and wrists were bound behind him. He could feel the bark of the tree rough against his back. Easter was practically growling at the other soldier, one Chris didn't recognize. "You best give me that jar, asshole," he snarled at the other man. "I found it, and I'll be damned you gonna eat it all." From the looks of it, The two soldiers were about to come to blows over the jar of pickled eggs they had found in Chris's pack. Tim Easter was a small man, no more than 5'6", if that. He was skinny, although recently he'd put on a little weight after his stash of meth had dried up. He was still stringy, though, and he smelled bad. Not just body odor, but that teeth rotting in your head kind of thing. He fingered the holster that held his knife, trying to decide if it was worth cutting the other soldier to get his share of the food back. Chris tried to get a better look at the other man, but when he moved his head, pain lanced through him and he let out a small groan. This earned him the attention of both men. Through the haze of pain, he could see they were both grinning with sadistic delight. He didn't recognize the second soldier at all. "All right, our little runaway's waking up," Easter crowed, looking ready to do more damage. He stood up, the pickled eggs forgotten, and unsheathed his knife. "You know, Lieutenant Cooper said to bring you back, but he sure didn't say I had to do it all in one piece." Chris sneered back at the little man. "Lieutenant Cooper is a psychopath, and you're just his sad little suck-up, Easter." It was stupid to trade insults when he was at such a clear disadvantage. The fist that smashed into his face loosened a tooth and broke his nose. The second blow knocked him out for the second time that day. As he slowly regained consciousness, he noted that the jar of pickled eggs was empty. So were the beans. His stomach roiled and his head throbbed. Now he was bleeding from a cut below his right eye, copiously from his broken nose and the earlier cut on his forehead. Chris looked as bad as his head felt. He spit a small glob of blood out of his mouth and focused his eyes on his two captors. Easter turned back at him, eager to hit him again. He didn't like fair fights, 'cause he never won them. This advantage was more his style. "Wake up and ready for more, you little fuckwad," he sneered. When Chris didn't respond, he just smiled more. "Your little sis, now she was always ready for more." Chris tried to still his response, but his pulse quickened and he stiffened. It wasn't just his blood that was making him see red. Easter grinned over to the other soldier. "Burton, you ever have any of that sweet ass? The bitch was in the second room on the left. She was good at fucking." Burton spoke up. "Oh yeah, nice sweet ass. You could tell she liked every minute of it." "Shame Coop killed her." Chris's fury at the two had been building to frenzy until the last remark. He stiffened against the bindings, unsure he had heard right. Easter was watching closely, and he nodded. "Yup, he strangled those stupid whores, both of them. Caught up to him the same night as the storm and made both of them pay for all the trouble they'd caused. Shame, too, about your sister. Shit, she was good for at least a few more weeks of screwing." Chris lunged against his bindings and felt one of the bindings give just a little bit. He could hear a hoarse scream of pain and then recognized that it had come from his throat. Not Jess. Oh God, not Jess. He shouldn't have listened to Alan. He should have gone in there, died fighting, anything but let them try to escape on their own. He howled in grief. "You're lying!" If Jess was dead, then he was all alone. No family, no one to go home to. Much to Easter's and Burton's disappointment, the news that his baby sister was dead quickly turned Chris's initial anger and denial into shock and unresponsiveness. All of their taunts were met with silence. He did not move when they kicked him or hit him, and he said nothing at all. Easter and Burton left him tied to the tree all that night, and didn't bother offering food or water. They had also taken a great deal of pleasure recounting Alan Banks's fate to Chris. He had no idea that Alan was the only truth they told that night. All that Chris knew was that no one who had escaped that night had gotten very far. He was the only one left. Eventually, they stopped talking trash and grew bored. As the fire settled into deep orange coals, the two soldiers wrapped themselves up in their blankets and fell asleep. They were undisciplined, good only for simple missions like fetch and retrieve, or securing food and weapons. They didn't think to take turns staying awake to keep an eye on their prisoner. As the two soldiers slept, Chris worked on a section of the rope, sliding it up and down over the rough bark of the tree. It was close to dawn when the rope finally broke. He didn't run. He retrieved a knife discarded from dinner on the ground near the campfire. Then he quietly arranged the bindings so that they appeared intact. Easter and Burton had been tasked with bringing him back to the camp. They would be heading back today. If he ran, they would chase him and likely bring even more men with them. He couldn't risk it. Some dark part of him wanted them dead anyway. That dark part relished the idea of spilling their blood and ridding the world of their filthy, stinking presence. So he waited, eyes closed to slits until Burton roused first. The man stretched and yawned and staggered off to the woods to piss, kicking at Easter when he passed him. Easter cursed and sat up, looked over at Chris and decided to have himself even more fun. He threw his blanket off, stood up and swaggered over to the tree where Chris hunched and feigned sleep. He unzipped his pants and aimed the stream of urine straight at Chris's head. What happened next was so quick, so brutally final that Easter didn't even have time to scream. As he fell to the ground, blood gushing from his genitals and then a second later from his neck, he just looked confused. He died that way, on the ground, his simple little mind unable to understand how a man could move so fast when he was tied up. A few minutes later, Burton's body joined Easter's. Chris stood there for a moment, looking down at the two lifeless bodies at his feet and feeling nothing but a red haze of pain inside and out. Monsters like these had killed Jess. Monsters like these had killed his parents, his friends, and everyone he loved. He dragged their bodies into the thicker forest, as far from the road as he could stand to drag them. He pulled brush, dead tree limbs, and leaves over the bodies, returned to the campsite and tamped out the last of the smoldering coals. With luck, no one would find the bodies or the campsite for a long time, perhaps never. He rinsed his hands and face as best he could in a small stream nearby. He had collected the revolver from Burton and another knife from Easter. He gathered up all of the food that was left, which wasn't much, and stuffed it into a rucksack with a blanket. Burton's blanket had smelled slightly less rank than Easter's, but they were both wretched, stinking things. He picked the lesser of the two evils, hitched the rucksack onto his shoulder, stuck the revolver in his jacket pocket, and headed for the small pickup truck they had been driving. He'd drive it out of gas and then ditch it. It was limited to roads and he'd wanted to disappear. That meant going on foot and probably cross-country. But for now, he wanted some distance between the bodies and him. If they caught up to him again, they wouldn't bother trying to take him back. After what he'd done to the other two, they'd shoot him on sight and apologize to Cooper later. The tank showed as half full. That was good luck. The first in days. Chris figured he could get 100, maybe even 150 miles from the truck before it ran out of fuel. As he steered the truck onto the road, Chris took a long look up the road he had come from before he turned and headed south. Home wasn't home anymore. Not without Mom or Dad or Jess. Home was gone, and so was the life he had known. He didn't know where he would end up, but he couldn't go back. Not ever. The faded green pickup headed south, all alone on the road, as the rain started up again.